GLOBIS.
Welcome, everyone, and panelists. We have 45 minutes in which to thoroughly understand what is going on in the UK, the US, and Japan. So, how we approach, I was saying that I realized that we were in bad straits the other day when I was looking at CNN online, and there was some analysis of what was going on in the UK, and the analysis said, and to explain what's going on in Ireland is too complicated. That's it. So let me start, Nick, and I apologize, first of all, by using everyone by their first names, but let's just keep this informal. What's going on?
Well, 3 years ago, the public in the United Kingdom voted narrowly but decisively to leave the European Union. Everyone knows that the breakdown was 52 to 48. Political leaders immediately then said that the results had to be honoured, and the British public had been told during the referendum campaign that their decision would be honoured. So though it wasn't instantly legally binding, we could have legislated to make it so. It wasn't advisory, as some people are claiming, not morally. Anyway, so the then Prime Minister immediately said it had to be implemented, and he had promptly resigned as well. Since then, we have been wrangling, trying to work out how to leave. And the majority of members of Parliament voted to trigger Article 50, which is the process by which we leave after a 2-year period, but then got cold feet about whether we should leave or not. And the House of Commons has simply been unable to agree the manner by which we leave. A new Prime Minister, so we've now had 3 Prime Ministers in a period of 3 years, which is unusual in our system, is now committed to leaving on the 31st of October, come hell or high water, to use his expression. The House of Commons has just legislated to prevent him from doing so. So we have an impasse, and nobody knows how it's going to be resolved. It's a desperately unsatisfactory situation.
Thank you. I think what we will do is hit each of our panelists to give that kind of an excellent summary, and then we will get into the controversies. Abdul, explain my country to me.
I wouldn't venture to try that. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me. Excited to be here to talk about where we are. So for us, if you really just want the top line, we elected a reality TV show president of the United States. And that you all know. I want to, as we talk today, talk about 3 intersecting trends that I think are critical to understand this moment in American politics. First, unfortunately, American politics over the last 2 decades has often been decided at the extremes rather than in the middle. And it has taken politicians, unfortunately, years to figure that out. And we have been trying to do politics in the middle while the population tends to work at the extremes. How are we moving when it comes to basic ideals around what our country is? Which is the second question. We are a country where to have the nationality, you don't necessarily have to have the ethnicity. And even if you have the ethnicity, then you're one of a small proportion of people who are First Nations or Native Americans. This is a country of immigrants. And so, my family, my father immigrated from Egypt, and my stepmother, who raised me, is a daughter of the American Revolution, meaning her family was there when the country was founded. That is the complexity of identity in our country. So I am an Egyptian American, and I still have family that I can trace back to the founding of the country. Whether or not we are a country of white people, or we are a diverse, heterogeneous society, is something that people foundationally disagree on. And this is a fault line in American politics. We thought we dealt with this when we elected an African-American president. The truth of the matter is racism is far deeper than one election. And then the third question is, how do we deal with the advent of automation and the new type of economy that has left folks in a moment where our social safety net in our country is foundationally porous, And so we've relied on a traditional system of economics to provide people basic means of living through a job that came with benefits that allowed them to have a fair wage, take care of their children, have a home. And of course, that was also differential based on race. And today what we're finding is that has started to disintegrate because largely automation, partly globalization, but mainly automation. And so while unemployment is at an all-time low, underemployment is at an all-time high. And that has manifest in our politics in a way that puts stressors on these other questions that we talked about. And then lastly, the way we communicate our politics has changed tremendously in the era of social media. And that has been exacerbated in large part by foreign actors who want to manipulate American politics. And so these are the intersecting trends that I think have led us to this moment in our politics, and the set of questions that we are actively asking ourselves, and the set of questions that we will imminently be asking about who our next president will be in 2020.
Thank you. That was great. Mieko-san, so it's interesting because I, like many of us who've been involved with Japan Watchers for years we were sort of saying, and what's going on with Japan? You know, the lost decade, Japan was the problem. And now, today, we're sort of in a situation where we're saying, hey, how come it's working in Japan? How come all is it? So, but one of my questions is it really working in Japan? You know, so I'll let you talk a little, and then I'm going to come back to you.
Thank you very much, Abigail. She's, I think, the ideal moderator because she knows Japanese politics so well, even better than I do, maybe. And she observed the time that I ran from the opposition party and took over the government, and it didn't work very well. It's so frustrating to me because I came back from the United States and I learned lots of things in the United States and I wanted to make Japanese democracy better. That is almost one-party control for nearly 70 years. But eventually, it didn't work, and Japanese people chose to have a stable society instead of internal, not revolution, but innovation and renovation. Well, maybe because Japan experienced deflation and lost decades before EU and the United States experienced that kind of things. Therefore, during the sad time, Japan had so much energy for government change and all sorts of things. That's why eventually Democratic Party of Japan took over the government. But the party was so underprepared, even not prepared very well. That's why people were all of a sudden realized that, oh my gosh, it is very difficult to rely on some kind of party that is so inexperienced. And now, even if you ask younger people, more than 80%, even in my class at Waseda University, say that they prefer to have a stable government, to prefer to have a prime minister that can stay at his position for longer than other head of the states all over the world, because it is such an advantage of Japan to appeal. Maybe that is the only way to appeal that Japan is there. So there are lots of resentment about the change of the government, but still, in my opinion, I think Japan needs to evolve and to have a little better way to choose the government according to differences in policies and to give opportunities to the people how to choose their own government accordingly, because elections are the almost only opportunities for the ordinary people to think about the politics and policies, and Japanese people are left behind. Therefore, sometimes it is really scary if technology advances and Japanese people could be manipulated easily. That's my worry. And mass media and all sorts of things are also also afraid of going against the sitting members and government, and it's stable. But maybe on the surface, and the division of poor and rich are really approaching to Japan, and women are really disadvantaged, particularly if they are single mothers, and children are raised under sometimes very disadvantaged situations. So Japanese society is not as stable as it appears from the surface.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I was just thinking, I don't know that I have ever, in my lifetime, seen Americans seeking to vote for stability. I might be wrong. But that's a big statement about Japan that may be a little different from some other countries. I'd like to go a little to the underpinnings, divided societies. We've talked about sort of the politics, but what is really going on in your views underneath? What are the rumblings that are sort of maybe erupting? Nick, is it uniquely the immigration issue? Are there other broader issues going on? What's your sense?
In the UK, I certainly don't think it is uniquely an issue about immigration. That is clearly one factor that has given rise to public concern, and it's allied with concern about security. And populist politicians play on that in a very disturbing manner. I think that much of the rise of populism, insofar as we've seen it expressed in support for Brexit parties and for the Brexit vote in the referendum in the UK, was as a consequence of the impact of globalization and specifically the financial crisis. And the downturn that happened as a consequence, because we saw a situation where the people were hurt by that, and incomes fell and have been relatively flat ever since. And I think that political leaders made a mistake during the referendum campaign of going around, and we was just saying, look, the economy is doing really well. Why bust this? We've been prosperous as a consequence of 40 years of being in the European Union, and that's not how people felt. People wanted to roll the dice. They did not feel that things were going well for them. And we had very low unemployment, but that gives rise to the question of what kinds of jobs were being created, and specifically the levels of people's income. So I think that you had the combination of those impacts, then the explosion of social media, which permits a different kind of campaigning, the security fears linked to high levels of immigration. And as a consequence, you had a perfect storm. And part of that was timing. It was just the timing of the referendum. In retrospect, it could hardly have been worse. But I do think that if you don't notice these concerns, and populist politicians do, that is the responsibility and a failure of conventional politics and politicians. If you cannot speak to people's concerns about their job and the wages that they're earning and whether they can afford housing or not, and they can't in the UK and haven't been able to for some time. People's dreams of owning property have evaporated. Rents are very high. If you don't properly address what are quite legitimate concerns about security, you can expect that someone else will charge in and will address those concerns, but in a very different manner. And so I have always thought that the rise of economic populism has a lot to do with the failure of conventional politics, and we too much demonize the public, in my view, for voting for these politicians. I think this happens, if I may say so, in the United States as well. We demonize the public I can't remember the exact phrase of Hillary Clinton's. It was the incorrigibles or whatever. Deplorables. That's right. Deplorables. And don't think hard enough about why people have felt motivated to vote in the way that they do.
Yeah, so Abdul, could we have just taken everything that Nick said, other than the word Brexit, and overlaid it onto the U.S. and had the same thing? Or what's the same, what's different?
So, in America, we just do it bigger. So, yes. Big
Mac politics.
Exactly, right. Bigger and faster. So the points that he made were correct. I think the word we have not said yet that I think hangs over the whole conversation is inequality. And what do you do in a moment where we have watched as the traditional markers that we have talked about around the quality and robustness of the economy have been fundamentally decoupled from the well-being of people's lives? And that's the moment that we're in right now. And so you have these markers that politicians and corporations point to and say, economy's working in tip-top shape. And unfortunately, because of the porous barrier between our economy and our politics, we have watched as there has been a system of, in effect, corporate rent-seeking that basically just takes our politics and says we're going to use that to serve these corporations and has decoupled them from people. A lot of that happened during the Great Recession. Why? Right? Once the recession hit, a whole lot of people got let go of their jobs. And as things started to get better, so much of the focus was on making sure that it got better for corporations with the idea that somehow jobs would follow. And what those corporations did with the money that they got through things like bailouts was usually invest in the capital that ultimately made it so that they would never have to really hire those people again in the same way. And so, I'll tell you about, I ran for governor in the state of Michigan, which is one of those swing states that helped to elect Donald Trump by 10,704 votes. And I talked to a gentleman named Chris in one of the swing areas of the state called Macomb County. And he was my Lyft driver, right? He was a driver who was picking me up in one of these rideshare apps in the morning. Chris is a trained machinist. He used to work in a robust manufacturing sector. He had gotten laid off during the recession and then found another job, right, that wasn't union protected because of all the union busting, and was at a supplier of the corporation he used to work for, which I think was Ford. And then that job didn't come with benefits, but it was still a job doing what he did. And then just a couple of weeks prior to when he picked me up, he had been laid off from that job and now is driving Lyft. He doesn't see a future where he has the same job he used to have. That kind of inequality in the setting of questions about who we are as a country, in the setting of a changing tone of conversation driven by social media, that's the moment. That's where we are. And to try and bring it back to Japan, the real question is, what do people choose in these moments? Second, how far has the decoupling happened here? When corporations do well, do people do well? And how much of our economy or Japan's economy is ceded to those corporations? How much is ceded and left in the control of real people? Those, I think, are the real fault lines, the real questions here.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one of the things that we're really touching on here is also generational shifts. Generational in the sense that my generation, you got a job, you had health care associated with the job, you had some kind of a pension plan associated with the job. That's it. And for many of us with kids, that's not what the kids are getting. So there are these changes. But that same kind of, these kinds of generational shifts were happening in Japan as well. And yet, we don't have the social upheaval. People voted for stability. So in some ways, you could say they must be doing something right because there was, is there a sense that somehow belief that the status quo government that has been in place for decades was somehow able to respond to these generational shifts.
That's right. There are, I think, mainly two reasons. One, economy, and another, SNS. younger people are overwhelmingly supporting the current ruling parties because Japanese economy is doing certainly better than before in terms of deflation. And currently, 2020 Olympics is expected. Investment is great. Constructions are going on everywhere. And we are really looking at the bright future. The problem is going to be after 2020 Olympics, because the economy may face the reality after that, because we are really spending so much money, running budget deficit, and investing or borrowing things from the future, and then pumping up the economy currently. Therefore, younger generation's employment rate is excellent. It is a employees market. Therefore, students love to have prime minister and ruling party LDP and Kome et al. Also, older generations benefited lots of things in the past, and maybe in the near future they are going to get enough pension money. And they are the ones who were educated after the World War II and concerned about Japanese democracy and all sorts of things. And they tend to support opposition parties still now. But the younger generations are coming in, the population is increasing, and the current party is aware of those people's importance. Therefore, so far, it looks really working very well. But in the future, the budget deficit is going to maybe come into their shoulders, and they have to pay more tax. Aging society is kicking in, and they really have to pay a lot. But at the same time, those older people are opposing any kind of policy change, and they're not really dying out so soon. Therefore, they will politically face difficulties to kind of cooperate with younger people. Therefore, I think a generational confrontation may be very difficult to resolve.
And for our duo over there, let me ask a really broad question. Is democracy ill? I didn't want to say is democracy dead, because of course we'll say no, but there actually is conversation out there about that kind of thing. But what's going on? We have these structural problems, these generational differences. Is our leadership going to be able to address them somehow?
So I actually don't think the problem is with democracy. I think the problem is with the absence of it. I think if you look at just in the United States, we have allowed our system to be encroached upon tremendously through the movement of money into politics, and rulings that say that corporations are people too, to quote Mitt Romney. That has, I think, in a lot of ways, decoupled democracy from the goals of democracy as it's practiced in the United States. I think if we want to save the way that we have made decisions in politics driven by the will of the people, then we actually have to bring democracy back. And I think in the United States, that means a couple of clear things. Number one, the way that money moves in politics. Just to give you an example, I ran for governor of one of the 50 states. We're the 10th biggest state in the country. I ran in a primary. We raised $5.5 million. We didn't take any money from corporate PACs. I don't believe in that. And we were outspent 6-1 in a 3-person field for a primary for an election. Running for office in the United States is extremely expensive. And if it's expensive, the more expensive it gets, the more it benefits those with money. And who do those tend to be? Those tend to be corporations. Put in perspective, the biggest lobbyist in the United States right now is the pharmaceutical industry. Why? Because unlike almost any other high-income country in the world, our government is legally forbidden to negotiate the cost of prescription drugs. We pay more than any other country. That's because over the last 20 years, the pharmaceutical industry has spent $4.4 billion lobbying. $4.4 billion lobbying. That money is what is, I think, corrupting so much of democracy, both in who gets elected and then what people do when they get in office. The second aspect of it is just manipulating rules of the games at the margin, right? The way that gerrymandering works, how you decide to draw a district based on who lives where so that that district benefits certain groups of people, right, and gets folks reelected. So in my state of Michigan, 47% about identify as Democrats, 36% identify as Republican. For the past several decades, we have had packed Republican legislatures at the state level. Why? Gerrymandering, right? And that's a corruption of democracy. And then lastly, you think about things, institutions like the Electoral College, which is easy to game, right? Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, and yet Donald Trump became president. And so I actually don't think the problem is with democracy. It's with the corruption of democracy by those who intend to make money off of it. And I think that really is the problem here. We need to take our democracy back.
Nick, over to you.
I certainly think that there are problems, perhaps not as great in the UK, because we have an independent boundary commission that doesn't allow the gerrymandering of boundaries. We have very strict rules around campaign finance. The problem we've found has been with social media and the manipulation of people's views by outside forces, and we're just coming to grips with that. I don't think it's been as serious a problem as in the US, but certainly it was an issue during the referendum campaign. So I do think you need kind of rules in place to ensure that democracy is functioning properly. Some people thought that the solution to the problems that we had, where you have a division of opinion on a fundamental issue, was that our system of representative parliamentary democracy couldn't properly answer the question, so we should put it out to the people in the form of a plebiscite, in the form of a referendum. And I think I was one of those people, and I have very definitely changed my mind, not just because I was on the losing side, but because I now see that actually if you put these decisions out in the way that we did, without thinking through exactly what the consequences are going to be, or if you find that there are narrow votes, you actually fuel populism and don't answer it. So I think there's a question of course, democracy always has to be the answer. We have to listen to people, but what we need is the political institutions to ensure that we can properly put into good policy what people's concerns are. And in the end, I think that comes down to leadership. And I think part of the problem has been a failure of good political leadership. You know, there's a fundamental question that we have to grapple with, fundamental question, which is how are we going to reshape our economic model that in the post-war era we thought was the way that would deliver wealth and security and happiness to people. We thought we had won the arguments of free markets versus state control, and certainly in the UK there are people who are fundamentally questioning that now in a way that hasn't happened for half a century, because that system of markets is seen to be letting people down. And when I talk about good policy and leadership, what is needed is for politicians, political leaders, to actually do some really serious thinking about how you change the model in a way that does not throw the baby out with the bathwater, still is able to ensure that wealth is generated and so on, but that it is shared more effectively. And that, I think, is the big economic challenge. And the bad news is, this is only going to get more difficult because the next wave of automation is coming. I'm sure this is being discussed throughout this conference. We're already suffering from the fallout of the last round of the economic revolution and globalization. We ain't seen nothing yet, and I don't think our structures and our thinking is sufficiently advanced to know how we're going to deal with this without finding more people like the driver that Abdul described, who just feel entirely left behind.
So is the problem a failure of political leadership or the limited influence of politics in today's societies. You know, you've talked about social media. Abdul talked about corporations. Mieko-san talked about this sort of longing for stability that sort of drives things perhaps beyond being responsive to some of the immediate needs. So are we really, you know, we started out talking about divided societies, but how much is this, as you talked about, Nick, there's sort of a snowball effect going on because the societies are divided. The question is whether governments can address it, and if not, where are we headed? Do you want to take that one up?
There has been almost a collapse in faith in politicians in the UK. I mean, the stock of politicians has never been high, and I think it's important we don't sort of get we realise, you know, we look back in history and realise that the public never did like politicians, and I think that's probably true in most countries. But I do think that the failure to deliver Brexit has further undermined people's faith in our system, because whichever side of the argument you are on, you are unhappy at the moment. If you're somebody who voted Leave, so if you're in that sort of cohort of around half of the country, you feel that the political system has not delivered what you asked for, and that actually makes people mistrust the system and erodes confidence in politics. If you're on the Remain side, you feel that politicians are betraying their own views and aren't listening to you. And if you're in the middle, which a lot of people quietly are, that however they voted, they just think that the politicians should get on with it, and they haven't. But in the end, this is really just a reflection of the fact that the public is divided on a fundamental issue. And I bet there are issues in every other country where you can see that there are similar sort of big divisions, and politicians then, you know, it's difficult to grapple with those issues where there is a fundamental division of opinion in society.
Abdul, do you think that people in the U.S. are fundamentally divided, or do you think that there are forces that are fanning the flames of division?
I mean, I think both. I think we are having in our country a really important debate about what it means. You know, our founding documents we often point back to because our country was founded on a set of ideals, right? Who is included in the concept of we the people? What does it mean to think about more perfect in the setting of more perfect union? And there are some who want to take us backward and some who want to move us forward. 2016 often, you know, I think we will look back on 2016 as a really important watershed moment. And oftentimes people say, well, that's because you all elected Donald Trump president. That's part of it. The other thing that happened in 2016 that people don't talk about is the median child born in the United States was a child of color. And that is a moment in our society where we have to ask, what is our national identity? Who are we? And who do we want to be? And I think this is a fundamental fault line. I do believe deeply in the future. To get to your question that you had asked also, though, about the role of politics and politicians, I happen to be someone who really does believe in government. And I come from public health. I'm a doctor by training, and I was the health commissioner in a city in Michigan. And public health is one of those things that's not flashy. People don't pay much attention to it, but it's operating there in the background, keeping you healthy, doing some very, very basic things like making sure your water is clean and, you know, the food is sanitary. And so that's an important government role. I think we were having a set of conversations that had lost people about more government or less government, about should government be involved in social norms or not. And I actually think the debate that we need to be having right now is about what government. And what government, to me, really reflects on the fact that I grew up in a time where our government went to war twice, and we're still involved in those countries, right? We spent $650 million a year, $650 billion a year outspending the next 7 biggest countries in the military. And we have not agreed that we should just give people in our country basic health care. And so I think my generation is starting to have a real conversation about what government, right? What should government be involved in and what should government stay out of, right? Maybe if we fought less war, we could be giving people health care. We could be paying people's tuition for college. And so these are the set of questions I think we're really debating, but we still don't have the language to debate them. And that's the last point I think on this point, is just that like politics happens in movements. And part of that is because we discover the language to talk about a feeling that we're all having, right? Great politics is about giving people the language to talk about the things that they want in their lives and that they need in their lives that hadn't been talked about. And I think we're generating a new set of languages in the United States about how to do that. So I actually think the future is very bright, but we're going to have to go through a moment of adjustment, and that is this moment. And I do hope that once we've come through it, right, the institutions realign around the things that we need to be focused on.
It's interesting when you said the real question is what kind of government. I thought you were going to talk about state rights, state versus national government, which then made me think about one of the divisions in Japan between the challenges that the prefectures are facing versus the challenge of Tokyo. So I always think it's good, when we think of Japan, to sort of take it to the next level, because the Japanese culture is one of sort of an effort to appear to respect consensus, but speaking personally, I think it's also we have to go to the next level and try to listen to some of the challenges being faced. So can you talk a little about that?
That's right. Japanese government is traditionally centralized very much compared to the United States. But there are some movements of giving more sovereignty to local governments. And one example would be Osaka Ishin no Kai, another party that is pro-constitutional amendment, but at the same time, in a sense, liberal, to divide more power to local governments. Those are a new phenomena and a new generational, I think, politics. However, as listening to U.S. and the U.K. examples, Japanese case is also interesting because first, Japan learned from U.K. and employed parliamentary system, which is supposed to be more stable than the presidential system in the United States. However, after the World War II, Japan learned committee system from the United States, and committee first policy is implemented there, and lots of like a constitution and a committee system and diet laws, that kind of things are imported from the United States. After looking at some confusions and divisions and unstableness in the United States and UK, we may wonder what kind of things that we can do and we can learn from them. One thing, Japan could be in a similar situation, but things that I learned from all those governmental changes in Japan, besides SNS and economy, because Abdul mentioned electoral system a little bit, Japan uniquely employs proportionate districts that can bring half of the diet members to the government or the legislative body. That means, I think opposition party would never gain enough unity and power because they are always divided because of the advantage of proportionate seats that small, teeny, tiny new parties can gain all the time. And they are the dividing force, division of Japanese policies from nuclear energy to something against against NHK and all sorts of things, and far left ideology to be sold through Reiwa, Shinto, or whatever. So those can become very popular from time to time. That is because of proportionate district, which is very different from other situation. And maybe that's the reason of stableness.
Thank you. I think I want to open it up. This is such a big topic. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So let's start.
I think you raised some very important points, like Citizens United, and also having worked in the Senate. After elections, Republicans and Democrats used to have lunch and dinner and collaborate. It doesn't happen anymore. So you can see these changes very visibly. The question is, when we talk about democracy, we've hit a point which, with Cambridge Analytica as an example, where the social media profiling of individual voters is so superb, you can now psychologically manipulate individual voters, both internally with political consultants and externally, as Vladimir Putin has done very successfully in the United States, and a bit in Brexit as
question?
well. So the question is, how do we defend ourselves from these new technologies, which are much more aggressively affecting individual voter decision-making through scientific profiling? What are the tools we build to defend ourselves from that?
So you brought up a couple of great points, and even the point that you made about people having lunch together, that's still a social media issue. Why? Because somebody's going to get a picture, and then they're going to throw it up on social media and be like, look, they're meeting with the opposition, right? Canceled. And the challenge with social media at its core is that it enables conversation, sure, right? A volume of conversation, but not a depth of conversation, nor a restraint of which conversation. So I know for myself that when I'm in a moment of conflict, my first instinct is probably not my best instinct. But Twitter, right, it enables your first instinct, right? Put it right up in a tweet, right? And the more outrage, the more retweets you're gonna get. So it just fuels that system. And it doesn't allow context in conversations, right? So that picture of two senators having lunch, like if you look at actually how people have adjusted around that. So I think in the United States, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez uses social media better than anyone else. What she does when she's going to meet with opposition is she telegraphs it. I'm meeting with this person about this. Why? Because the cost of potential meeting without having telegraphed why can be deadly. And so it just changes everything. I think 3 points to answer your question though. Number one, I think we just need to figure out how to regulate social media in a thoughtful way, right? So one easy approach there would just be to say, dear platforms, you have to get bots off your platform, and we will fine you for bots, right? So bots are these like fake accounts that just move information in ways that make them explosive. Another way is just to say, we're gonna break up a lot of the corporations. So Facebook, for example, is not just Facebook. Facebook is Facebook, it's Messenger, it's WhatsApp, it's Instagram. And the ability to concentrate power and manipulate algorithms across those concentrates the ability that it has. And then 3, we are going to make sure that you police your platform around fake information that's moving. Now that becomes really hard, right? Because as Donald Trump has shown, you can weaponize the term fake news, right, to cast aspersions on real news and then move fake news, which is exactly what he does, right? Because for folks like him, the thing that you want to do is devastate any sense of what's true, right? Because then if there's nothing that's verifiable and nothing true, then it's just whose message and everything becomes a story. And then the second point is that I think we just need to get frankly, money out of politics. Because the reason that all of these Cambridge Analyticas, et cetera, can work is because people have the money to pay for them. And if you were to take the money entirely out of politics, it becomes really, really hard to pay for them. And then third, we've got to figure out how to talk or do something about Citizens United. Supreme Court's not going to solve it anytime soon, but it is having a devastating impact on our politics because it is the reason why money moves so easily. And in case folks don't know what Citizens United is, it's a Supreme Court case that basically said that A, corporations are people, right? They have the rights of people in the United States, and B, that money is speech, right? And so corporations spending money is in effect protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. And you can see how that's a really, really problematic ruling.
I'm going to take a few questions at once next. So why don't we 1, 2, and then 3.
Thank you. My name is Doga from Japan. I want to dig a little bit deeper on the next year's presidential election. Would Andrew Yan's universal basic income, do you reckon, could possibly solve your friend Chris's problem of losing a job?
Hi, thanks. As a London resident here, so let me take opportunity to ask the MP Nick. What's actually the most kind of optimistic outcome after the Brexit deliveries? Half of the population say no 3 years ago, and another half is getting skeptical about Brexit's future right now. But as you literally said, you need to deliver the Brexit anyway. So I want to see what's the kind of positive, optimistic scenario after that. It's really hard to see for me right now.
Tatsuo, must I have a question to Nick? You talked about not to demonize the population. I really like it. But we talk about populism there, even from Roman Empire, and that is also a result of populism. So if we say populism today, how different they are, how different it is from the past. Thank you.
Nick, 2 for you, and 1 for Abdul.
I'm not sure it is different. I think there are broadly 2 types of populism. We've really only talked about one, which is kind of economic populism. But there is also cultural populism, and nativist politicians tend to embrace some kind of fusion of the two. So they try to manipulate opinion about national identity. And so on, and that too has been made harder by the impacts of globalization and migration. I think I take it back to I think that what good politics and good politicians have to do is listen to the concerns of people and address them with good and reasonable policy, and not to demonize people and say those concerns don't matter. If you vacate the ground, someone else will enter it. The leader of the Liberals, the Prime Minister of Australia, has just won an election. Yes, his party is on the centre-right. It's the governing Liberal Party, but it is not an extremist party. His entire pitch was to talk about the quiet people of Australia, going back to the ideas of I suppose Nixon's silent majority and so on. These terms can make people uncomfortable, but what he was really saying was he wanted to try and understand what ordinary Australians were thinking about issues and respond to them. On Brexit, what's a good outcome? Let's just run very, very quickly through the possible outcomes. Possible outcomes are that there is a second referendum. Personally, I think that would be highly problematic if it resulted in a narrow majority for Remain, because all the people that voted Leave would then question the legitimacy of having a question asked for a second time, and it would lead to further instability. We could revoke Article 50 altogether. That runs into the same problem. We could have no deal, which has big implications for the economy and for the union. The best outcome would be to do a deal, leave with a transition period in an orderly manner, and then strike a close economic and trade partnership and security partnership with the European Union. And I still think that is possible.
Abdul, 1,000 a month?
Yeah, look, I think it's really great that we're having an honest conversation about universal basic income. And in case folks haven't been watching closely, there is a sort of dark horse candidate who has never run for office ever. His name's Andrew Yang, and he's running on one idea, which he's calling the freedom dividend, which is a universal basic income. What it would be is an unconditional cash transfer of $1,000 a month into the pockets of every American, doesn't matter who you are. I do think that some form of either UBI or a jobs guarantee is something that is almost inevitable in our future. It's not a new idea, it's just new again. And I do think it would help people like Chris, right? It does offer you some system of support. The issue that I have with it right now are two. Number one, three. Number one is that politically we still haven't messaged it correctly, right? And there's still a lot we have to talk about why. Because automation is coming, right? There's a great economist named Dave Otter out of MIT who talks a lot about where it's coming. And I think the first round of automation that Nick talked about was the automation that took a lot of repetitive manual jobs. The next round is going to be aiming for traditionally middle and upper middle class jobs, things like being a paralegal or being a surgeon even, right? Or being a radiologist, right? I mean, the idea that a machine trained on every CT that's ever happened isn't better than a doctor at diagnosing disease from a CT is absurd. So it's coming. So number one, we haven't talked about it well. Number two, a lot of the plans right now say we replace every other piece of the welfare state, which to me is really problematic because at some point, how do you think about things like housing and healthcare? And I think those things are critical. And taking them away to give everybody $1,000 a month will leave some people making just $1,000 a month, right? Which is a big problem. And then the third issue that I have with it is that there is something about the role that we all have in society and in government that has something to do with the fact that we all pay taxes. And the political economy of the transfer, right, by which, in effect, we're ceding our stake in government to corporations who pay taxes to government to give us money to pay corporations to buy stuff, loses some of the implicit political power of the everyday citizen. Because so much of it in our mind says, well, I pay taxes, I have a stake in this government, and I get to decide what it does. And that stake is not just psychological, it's real. And so at some point when you start saying, actually, no, most of the tax burden is going to be put on these huge corporations, what you're doing is implicitly giving them a lot of power. And that power is dangerous in my mind.
Okay, thank you. I think you had a question?
Thank you for panel and the interesting discussions. I want to ask one question to Mieko-san that concerning Japanese younger generations thought and they naturally experienced relatively stable environment, especially young employment situations. But the majority of people in the younger generations tends to really check the smartphones to get the news. And then if you access to, say, Yahoo or Google and Microsoft News, that some of the Japanese really news were really adapted from the, say, Sankei or, it's the Yomiuri newspapers. And they do not really spend so much time to, think of the depths and the behind the scenes. That could be, really one of the reasons why that they could really simply rely on the current administration. And also that worries me that when we face such a difficult, unprecedented environment surrounding Japan, that younger leader, next leader, probably people really attend here is all right, but majority of younger generations, how they can really and then find the truth.
Very important subject. I'm teaching at Waseda University and carrying 5 classes a week. I meet lots of young people and I ask lots of questions to them. What they think about Japanese democracy, what they think about Japanese future and leadership and so on. Most of them, they know what kind of political system that we should ideally pursue. However, they always say that, more than 80% of us would vote for the current party. And when I ask them all the reasons, then some of them are really nice to think that current Japanese situation is not that advantaged, looking at China and all sorts of superpower arising, and Asian economies rising, but Japan is just staying almost still. Therefore, they thought for Japanese sake, it is important to have a strong and appealing leadership, which is understandable. But other than that, they didn't really understand the deep Japanese discussions or history of democracy that the predecessors tried to achieve. The reason is SNS, because they are reading news from SNS. They are getting information from their friends. And then if they attach Sankei newspaper article there, then they read from there. So it is very important point that algorithm should be somehow altered to give them more wide scope of what's going on in the world. Currently, it is very difficult. Also, they don't even watch TV these days. I oftentimes comment on TVs, but they don't know that I am there. Oftentimes, as a professor, I am afraid that, oh my gosh, the students will be seeing me on TV. I'm so embarrassed. But don't worry about it. Nobody knows. It's really amazing. Therefore, yeah, right. Certain generations or people know that kind of things because they monitor TV shows and what kind of opinions are there. But young people don't do that. They just get news and opinions from internet. Therefore, we try, as a teacher, I try to broaden their scope and let them read different aspects of the society and policies. But still, it is very difficult to lead them into that way. And I wonder if there are other university students who are not getting a wide range of news, because it's Waseda University, which is supposed to be pretty good at studying things, but still at their level, the information is very limited. So your point is extremely appreciated, and we should think about that more.
We have time for one more question. I saw your hand has been up, so very, very quick.
Yeah. Taro Kono this morning said the rule of law is paramount. I'd like to know if you agree, and I'd particularly like to ask Nick how he squares that with his description of the current situation as an impasse between Boris Johnson's intention and the clear position of the law on what happens on 31st.
I agree that the rule of law is paramount, and I think it's unfortunate that the tensions that we've got at the moment have resulted in decisions which may have long-term implications. Our Speaker of the House of Commons has allowed the legislature to take control of the agenda in a way that has denied the executive from exercising the proper function of government. The executive has retaliated by proroguing suspended parliament for an unusually long period of time. We'll see on Wednesday whether the courts will uphold that or not. It may be that our system proves more resilient in the end, our unwritten constitution, by the way in which we're dealing with this of getting us through. But the principle that you set out, the rule of law, must surely be paramount.
Thank you all. I want to thank especially Nick and Abdul for entering into politics, because that's a real message of hope for all of us. I don't think one can be a politician and a pessimist, so thank you. And Miyako-san for being a teacher. So thank you. Please join me in thanking our guests.